Good afternoon. Welcome to Cracking the Millennial Code. One of my colleagues, Brad Wilson, somebody asked him about my book, and he said, yeah, you open it up, and all it says is you're hopelessly screwed. He said that was the executive summary, so got to give each other a hard time. So, today we're going to talk about millennials, one of my favorite subjects. And the agenda, we're going to talk about what are millennials, what environment did they grow up in. Every generation is very much impacted by the world which they grow up in. If you understand that environment, you'll understand them better. What are some of the defining characteristics of this generation? Every generation has defining characteristics. Doesn't mean that everybody operates that way exactly, but overall you kind of see those tendencies. And most importantly, what do we do in our firm to create a strategic culture to win with these folks? And then at the end, I'm going to share some mythbusters, some things I commonly hear, thought about this group that are really not true. So let's dive in. First of all, why does it matter to me? I think we got a lot of older generations in the room. Maybe we have a few millennials. So why are we talking about this? One guy, when I wrote the book, he said, why aren't we talking about my generation? Who cares about this generation? Well, it may not matter unless your goal is to win. That's what we're here talking about. The theme of the conference is thrive. To me, that's winning. How do we win in our organizations moving forward? And if you're going to win, you have to win with people. Nobody that's done anything significant in this business has done it by themselves. They've had to have strong, successful people around them to work as a team to make that happen. I once got introduced as a keynote speaker at a conference by a lady as speaking on working with millennials. I'm not here to talk about working with millennials. That suggests we want to tolerate them. We want to manage them. I'm here to talk about how do we win with them. How do we attract the best and the brightest to our firms? How do we create a culture where they want to stay? And most importantly, how do we unleash their energy in our firms to win? The generational conflict's been around a long time. You got the millennial on the left, up all night without sleep. Awesome. On the right, you got the boomer, slept all night without getting up. Awesome. I'm not going to ask you how many slept through the night without getting up last night. It's funny how quickly that changes, isn't it? Here's another one. Millennial says, I'm home, and he says, oh, hi, Jeremy. You notice how those arms start getting long on you all of a sudden? And how did that happen so quick? It seems like we were just the kids out of college yesterday. So let's take a little test. I want you to, in your mind, complete the phrase. And actually, you can shout it out. Complete this phrase. When E.F. Hutton speaks, people listen. If you're a millennial, you do not know the answer to this phrase. Because this commercial was from the 80s, believe it or not. So this is your Millennial Test. So if you knew that phrase, you can be pretty much assured you're not a millennial. So the ones that were able to answer that last test, can you relate to this comment? This new generation is more self-focused than any previous generation. Anybody relate to that? This was in Time magazine last year. It was a quote, but the quote was not from 2014, it was from 1914. What does that tell you? The old hell in a handbasket theory. Every generation behind us is going to hell in a handbasket. Did the people above us not think about us like that when we were coming through? This has been going on before any of us were born. So where do you fit in the generational mix? So I'm going to start with the generations that are still in the workforce. Believe it or not, we still have a few veterans, people from the veterans generation in the workforce. They're now over 85. So I mean, we're there, and these are some of these owners that won't quite let go, haven't started their ownership transition plan yet. But they're going to get to it. Trust me, they're going to get to it. This was the veterans generation. They were the greatest generation. These were the folks that fought in World War II. And it was a very large generation. They were born before 1927. Every generation has an event that anybody in that generation can tell you where they were when that happened. For these guys, it was Pearl Harbor. The next generation you don't hear talked about very much is the silent generation, born between 1927 and 1946, much smaller generation. These were the kids that were too young to fight in World War II. Okay, so they were, and it's a smaller generation because people didn't want to have a lot of babies back then. You had the Great Depression, then you had a world war going on. There wasn't a lot of excitement and encouragement about the future, so it's a much smaller generation. Anybody know what their defining event is for most of that generation? Take a guess. It's Victory in Europe Day. Which U.S. presidents from this is a 20-year period, which U.S. presidents are from this generation, were born during this 20-year period? Anybody name any? Know which ones they were? Which one? No, Carter was a boomer. What was that? Reagan. Reagan was Reagan was from the veterans generation, I believe. Who?
Kennedy?
No, Kennedy was a boomer. Zero.
Wow.
Zero. Isn't that amazing? We had boomer presidents, and all the boomers at the time were saying, "Oh my gosh, what's going to happen to this country when we had veterans presidents, and they said, what's going to happen when the boomers get in the White House? This country is going to the dogs." We now are completing our 24th year of boomers in the White House. Clinton was the first, then the second Bush, and now Obama. Why do you think nobody from a 20-year period of the silent generation ever got elected to the White House? Small generation. They don't appeal to a large voting bloc. In fact, you're going to see in this upcoming election the impact of the millennials on the election outcome is going to be tremendous. Because for the first time, almost 90% of the generation is going to be eligible to vote for the first time in a presidential election. And it's a large generation, so it's going to have a big impact. Next generation, the boomers, 1946 to about 1964. We hear, gosh, you heard growing up, that's all you heard about was the stinking boomers and everything they were doing to affect everything. When the GIs from the veteran generation came home, they got busy, they had lots of kids, and this is a very large generation. For boomers, what's the event that they can all remember where they were? Dallas, that's right. Kennedy assassination. They can all tell you where they were on that day. Next generation, Generation X, 1965 to 1979. Anybody remember this guy? Who's that? Michael. What was he playing? What character? Marty McFly. Remember Marty McFly? He went 30 years into the future, and that 30-year date was just a couple of weeks ago. So boy, that doesn't make you feel old. Marty McFly, Michael J. Fox was a boomer, but he was playing a Generation X because he graduated in 1985 in this movie, which was the front end of the Generation X generation. And if you go back and watch the movie, it has a very Generation X feel to it. Their event was the Space Shuttle Challenger explosion. They can all tell you where they were when they found out the Space Shuttle had exploded. The millennial definition, and there's a lot of argument about this, but in general, it's people that were born around the year 1980 to the year 2000, so that 20-year period. So we're talking about people now that are 15 to about 35, so from high school age to then coming into our companies for the last 11, 12 years out of college. And I've heard some people that are in the millennial generation say, well, I'm not a millennial. Well, you really don't get a choice. It's when you're born. And since your parents didn't really ask you when that was going to be, you don't get really a choice. So, yeah, that's the general definition. Their defining moment is 9/11. They weren't old enough to remember the Space Shuttle Challenger, but they can all pretty much tell you where they were when they first heard about 9/11. I got a friend I want to introduce you to. This is Kyle. He's my representative millennial. He works for me, and he's very boisterous. He's an engineer, and he exudes a lot of millennial qualities. Can anybody tell me what Kyle is doing? It's a millennial activity. Anybody know?
Fishing with his hand.
Fishing with his hand. That's a good guess. No. Noodling. No, he's not noodling. Looks like he's noodling. We'll come back to Kyle. Other names. They're also called Generation Y. Some people get this confused. Well, we got Generation X, we got Generation Y, then the Millennials. They're the same. Generation Y and Millennials are the same thing. They were called Generation Y because they were following Generation X. Also Echo Boomers because they're the children of the Boomers by and large. Generation Next. But really, they're the first generation to name themselves. Every previous generation has been named by social psychologists. But the late Peter Jennings on ABC News one night did an online poll and asked this generation what they wanted to be called, which kind of speaks a lot to the generation itself. And they said overwhelmingly Millennials. They didn't want to be attached to a past generation. And at the time, they were very excited about the newness of a new millennium coming along. So, test time. Here's what I want you to do. Close your eyes for a second. And I want you to think back to the first job you had in this business out of college, or the first job you had out of college, first professional job. Think about the sounds, the smells, the environment. All right, you got it? Now I'm going to ask you some questions. Was smoking allowed in the office? Remember that? What would happen if somebody lit up a cigarette in your office? What happened? I remember both my bosses smoked, and they would just chain smoke right over you. You didn't say anything about it. I mean, Did you have to sit behind a drafting table? Remember the drafting tables, the big T-bars, the smell of the ammonia wafted out of the blueprint machines? All this is gone. Did you have to wear a suit or a tie every day? A lot of folks back then, the dress code, I had 3 ties. They all had paisleys, and I just rotated. Every third day you saw the same tie. How about the interview process? When you went for your first job out of college, did you sit down with them? They said, we'd like you to come on board. And you said, okay, that's great, but I'd like to talk to you about the pay package. I'd like to talk to you about the training plan and the benefits. And is that what we did? Alex, what did we do?
I was happy to get a job.
You said thank you, right? A lot of us didn't even ask what we were being paid. We just thank you, we finally got a job. Is that what happens nowadays? No, they're asking a lot more questions. Things have certainly changed. And the point of this is, if you stop and think about how much our work environment has changed since we came into the business, over the next 20, 30 years, it's going to change that much again. And our tendency is to want to fight against it. But it's already changed a lot. It just happens. This is a 1950s engineering office. For those of you who can see that, take a look and tell me what jumps out at you is different. No phones, man. No cell phones, no computers. What else? No women. No women, it's all men. What else?
The boy that looks like he's 10 in the front.
This guy with the bow tie? He probably is.
Everyone's
probably,
wearing a tie.
Most of them are wearing ties and suspenders and bow ties.
No computers.
No computers. There's also no color in terms of ethnicity. It's a very white male bunch. Now you can tell this thing's staged, this picture staged, because there's no ashtrays on the drafting tables. So they put all those away. But you can imagine the smoke level probably wafted about halfway up in that place, and you can hear the buzz of the lights going on. Things have changed quite a bit. When I first wrote the book on millennials, the AP had just reported that this generation, when surveyed, thinks as differently from older generations as any generation had since the Vietnam War. And you remember in the Vietnam War how the generations battled because they thought differently. I was talking about voting in the election, the first election back in 2008. Millennials voted 2-for-1 for Obama. Well, there weren't many millennials that could vote at that time. Now, this next election, 90% of them are going to be able to vote, so they're going to have a big sway on election results. This is generational pyramid, and for this year, so on the left is men, on the right is women. You can look at your age and see right where you fit. Up top, you have the silent generation, which is starting to shrink because it's dying off. But then we have the big boomer generation, 74 million people. And then down below, their kids, the millennials, 83 million people. in this country. Between them is poor Gen X, sometimes called the sandwich generation. Almost looks like a sandwich, doesn't it? Gen X never gets any respect. Nobody markets to Gen X because they're a smaller generation. So, but you have two big generations around it. What significant event happened January 1st, 2010? Almost 6 years ago now. Anybody know? First boomer hit Social Security retirement age. 10,000 a day since that time have been retiring. 10,000 a day. Now, it was slow at first because most of them's 401ks became 201ks. But the market's picked back up, and you're starting to see boomers retire en masse. Isn't that true in your business? A lot of that institutional knowledge, those people you've had for a long time, are starting to look for an exit. Now, yesterday I did a workshop on human resources, and the number one issue they talked about was how hard is it to find somebody between 8 and 20 years experience. Difficult, isn't it? Why? It's a smaller generation, for one. Second reason is a lot of the Gen Xers came out when the economy was down in the toilet and we weren't hiring. So they went into other businesses. They did not come back. So if there's good Gen Xers out there in this business, they're being taken care of somewhere. So let me ask you this. If you want to grow your business in the future, where's it going to come from? Where are the people going to come from? It's not going to come from boomers. They're leaving. It's not going to come from Gen X. The only place it can come is from millennials. That's why this issue is so important. The good news is they are a large generation. Just this year, for the first time, millennials became the dominant generation in the U.S. workforce. They took over from the boomers. It skipped Gen X completely. See, no respect. So the boomers took over. In 10 years, in 2025, it's estimated that 3 out of 4 workers in the U.S. will be millennials. I think we got to figure these guys out. When you compound that with, in the U.S., you have architectural degrees on the bottom and engineering degrees on the top, going all the way back to 1971. There's been engineering degrees peaked in 1985 in this country and been on the downward swing ever since. The good news is, if you go 5 more years out to where we are now, it's starting to pick up again for most engineering, but not for electrical. But there's still, look at all the gaps in between where there weren't many degrees being issued. If that's not enough already, back in 2010, Money Magazine reported that over the next 10 years, so within 5 years from now, the U.S. is going to need 19% more architects and engineers. Not to replace the ones that are leaving, but on top of what we already had to be able to do the work demands that were going to be there. So the demand is really picking up. If you look at the hiring or the staffing level in North America, we were back in 2005, we're about 1.25 million. We got all the way up to almost 1.5 million. Then the recession hit. We shed almost 250,000 jobs during the recession. Now, we've been hiring since, and if you follow this out to now, it's almost back to the peak. But what happened to all those people that graduated from college during that dip? They went somewhere else. Architects went into designing video games, or they found other places. I believe all this, and I've been talking about this for 4 or 5 years from now, is really creating a perfect storm. The only thing that's been missing over the last 6 or 7 years is the economy doing like that. And now the economy's been doing like that for a while, and you guys are starting to find hiring to be very challenging. One of my colleagues came up to me and said at this conference, he said, "Wow, this war for talent, it's really hot." And it just came out of nowhere. I'm thinking, it didn't come out of nowhere. I mean, you could see it coming. But it is certainly upon us. But what I can tell you is we're just beginning to see the front of the storm. It's going to get a lot more challenging as the economy continues to improve. The challenge to find and keep good talent is going to be one of the most difficult things you're going to have to do. That's why I believe that the biggest structural change to our industry over the last 30 years is not information technology, it's not BIM, It's not design, build, or other delivery methods. It's the fact that we have moved from being an employer-leveraged industry where the employer had all the power in the hiring process to an employee-leveraged industry to where now the employee has all the power in the hiring process. I got to glance into this early about 10 years ago. I visited Western Canada and Alex's firm out there, and at the time, because of oil and minerals and the business they were in, their business was very hot, and it was already tremendously difficult to hire and has remained that way for quite a while there. But I got to see early on some of the challenges that we're all now starting to face relative to this battle. Now, it may sound like a problem, but to me this is not a problem. This is an opportunity for the smart folks. And you're here because you're smart. You want to do better than your competitors. I can tell you our industry as a whole is in denial. I don't know how many boomers and Gen Xers say, I don't care about millennials. I'm not changing the way I do things. And I'm thinking, okay, stupid is as stupid does. Because if we change, who's going to win the most? We are. Our generation, our firms. This also creates an opportunity for significant long-term competitive advantage. If moving forward, if you can position your firms to attract the very best of the millennials and to keep them, you're going to kick your competitors' tails. And that's what it's all about. So back to Kyle, let's talk about the environment that these guys grew up in, try to understand them a little bit better. Remember these signs? Remember those? These were the babies on board. These signs first came out in the early 80s when the first millennials were born. What was the generation called before them? Gen Xers, what were we often called? You remember? What? Latchkey. Why did they call us latchkey? Yeah, your parents were working. Both parents were working. You come home, you let yourself in, do your homework, get the house clean, you do dinner before your parents get home. And you were pretty independent, weren't you? That's not how it works. It switched right there about 1980. Parenting switched in this country, and that had a tremendous influence on how kids grew up. Parent advocacy. Chris, did you wear a bicycle helmet when you were a kid?
What's that?
One of these things here, you didn't have a bicycle helmet? Your mom didn't think there was anything valuable up there going on that you had to worry about? Or?
I'm sure I started wearing them as soon as I had kids.
Yeah, you started wearing them as soon as you had kids. You probably wear bicycle helmets? If your parents had got you a bicycle helmet, would you have wore it? No, why not? All your friends would have laughed at you, you big sissy. That's right, that's right. Nowadays, if you see a kid riding around without a bicycle helmet on, somebody's going to call the authorities. Can you imagine? Things have certainly changed. Who was our hero? Generation X and Boomers, who was our hero growing up? Remember this guy? Evel Knievel. What was his claim to fame? He had broken every bone in his body. Yes, we want to be just like him. We were a very intelligent generation. There's not any millennials in here spying on us, are there? I like this. The 1970s, no knee pads, helmets, brakes, or even cautious soccer moms. It's just how we rolled. See that guy on the big wheel coming across the homemade ramp? I remember those days. Things have changed. Now they have a new term in the dictionary called helicopter parent. Why do they call them helicopter parents? They hover. They hover. They're always close. They want to protect little Johnny from any physical or emotional trauma. It's amazing. I remember a couple years ago, my wife's cousin, their kids were going to college, and I found out that the mother did their essays, wrote their essays for them for their college applications. I'm like, what? How can you do that? Now I've got kids going to college, and it hit me, if I don't at least review these essays, they're competing against adults, not other kids. It's changed. So this helicopter parenting has become a big thing. They're also very busy. I was just talking to a parent last week, and his son is in fall soccer, winter soccer, summer indoor soccer, and 3 or 4 other sports. And I'm thinking, man, I'm so glad my kids don't have any athletic talent. That just sounds like it would drive you nuts. But have you noticed they're doing Taekwondo, they're doing music, they're learning a language, they're go. And I asked a bunch of millennials one time that worked for me, I got them together and was interviewing them for my book. They didn't know what I was doing. But I said, why did you guys not push back and say, we're not going to do this anymore? And Kyle, without even stopping eating, he said, well, we can't do that. Because who were we going to play with? Because all of our friends were at these events too. So if we'd have stayed home, there was nobody there. And I thought, why? I never would have thought of that. You remember when I was growing up, Mom said, get out of the house. If I see you before dinner, you're in trouble. Just I don't know where. I want to know where you are. Just go. But all your friends were out there, and you could do crazy things with. So I want to talk about their parents for a minute, because I was writing the book. My chief editor, my wife, said, you're being too tough on these parents. And we are millennial parents. Our three oldest are millennials. She said, what you have to understand is the safety of the environment in which these kids grew up in, either real or perceived, was much more dangerous than the one we grew up in. Now, I think it's perceived. I think the problem is that a kid in Colorado might get abducted. When we were growing up, you just didn't hear about it. There was no 24-hour news cycle. But now that stuff is constant. It's constant, and you wouldn't think about letting your kid just walk across the neighborhood. So a lot of it is responding to the environment that they're in. There are also, and my wife is a high school teacher, she said that about the time the millennials started coming through, they trained teachers and parents that these kids are going to grow up in a global world. And because of that, if they're going to compete, they need to get involved in a lot of activities. They need to have a lot of skills, and that's why they've been pushed to do so much. There is a new movement. It's called Freerange Parenting. I love this. The idea is you let your kids go out to play to the park on their own. Imagine that. Some people in Canada just got arrested, the parents did, for doing this. You remember reading about that? So I went home to my parents and said, guess what? You guys were free-range parents. They had no idea what I was talking about. So most of us grew up with free-range parents. But it's interesting. I think you'll see this trend happening more and more. So what defines their generation? They have a big focus on achievement. Millennials, if they have goals, they're very good at achieving those goals. And they've been doing it since before they got in school. They were coaches. Everybody was giving them goals. So they're very good at achieving goals. They're not very good at setting goals. Why? Somebody always did it for them. The coach, the parent, the teacher. So one of the things you have to work on, and we'll talk about in a minute, is helping them learn how to set their own goals and help other people set goals. They have a real desire for a work-life balance. And as I was listening to the Parsons CEO this morning speaking, he was talking about the difficulty of getting millennials to buy into his ESOP plan. This drives people in our business nuts, probably more. It's one of the top things that drives us nuts. We got a lot of boomers that want to sell out their business, and you're looking down at millennials saying, hey, you guys, you want to buy in? And we're not getting a lot of interest. And I was trying to figure out why. Finally, I realized when these guys were in the womb, they were listening to Mozart. When they were in kindergarten, they were told, listen, if you work hard, you can get into a good elementary school, you'll be set. In elementary school, they're told, listen, if you work hard, do a bunch of extracurricular activities and sports, you'll get into a good high school, you'll be set. They get to high school, they said, listen, if you'll take all these AP classes and do all these extracurricular things, you can get into a great college and you'll be set. They get to college and they tell them, listen, if you do great in college and do an internship and get good grades, you'll get a great job and you'll be set. So what happens? They come into our business and say, listen, if you'll sacrifice for 20, 25 years, you'll be set. And they say, I think I've heard this story before and I don't know that I believe it anymore. The other thing we do is we say, listen, Alex will come to him and say, listen, if you work hard for 20 years, you can be just like me. They say, wait a minute, Alex works every Saturday and Sunday, and they see the dark circles under their eyes, and they say, it's not a very good sales job. This is a tricky issue for millennials that they're really pushing back on. The other thing, millennials Boomers and Gen Xers, we have work and we have non-work. We have work and we have life. Millennials tend to blend life and work all together. They are much less likely to want to be at the office at 7:30 in the morning, but much more likely than other generations at 10 o'clock at night to pop open their laptop and do some work. They think more 24/7 than we did, and I think technology's helped with that. But I see boomers, and we'll talk about this more, but you have to be careful to find ways to give them some freedom to work in the way that they're used to. They are confident, bordering on cocky. This is Kyle. We had a cube decorating contest. He wrapped his cube in wrapping paper and put 2 women from God on it. And the little yellow note is some of the ladies in the office, their commentary on what they thought about his gift to the world there. The good ones are very confident. Why are they confident? They've been told all their life they can do anything they want to do. Coaches, parents, teachers, all told them, whatever you want to do, you can do it. Now, so it was a big lie. It's a big lie. You can't do anything you want to do. That's what they've been told. So they believe they can do anything. That's why they want to be a CEO of your firm when they've been out of school for 3 years. Why can't I be CEO? They have that confidence. Now, and it can come across as being cocky a lot of times. This is one of the traits about them I really like, though, because boomers and Gen Xers, we greatly are in a position to need to delegate work. We need to take a lot of tasks off our plates and give it to others so we've got some time to do some of these things we're talking about at this conference, right? Am I with the right group? They are a generation, one way that you can encourage them to want to stay is by delegating real responsibility down to them. The good ones love it. They love it. And they'll take it because they're confident. Now, you have to be careful because we have a duty to protect society, so you have to give them enough rope to hang themselves and be there to catch them when they do. You got to make sure that the quality's there when it goes out. But I tell you, some of these young people, you give them responsibility and they'll amaze you at what they can do. I like this comment from Doonesbury. He says, you put MIT on your application. She said, well, you told me I could be anything I wanted to be. Now you're telling me I can't go to MIT? He looks at his wife. He says, we may have overdone this self-esteem thing. And she says, well, it was best practice at the time. So we're dealing with some of the repercussions of that. They have difficulty with criticism. Why is this? Never got any. It's all been constructive criticism. Our coaches and our teachers, they gave us some constructive criticism growing up. They didn't mind, but coaches can't yell nowadays. Teachers can't yell. It's all positive feedback. This is challenging. Why? Because there are some difficult people in our business, are there not? Some of them are in this room. Some of them are our clients, and sometimes you have to deal with difficult people. This is also challenging when you're trying to coach and help develop them. One of my peers was working with a young millennial. He had hired a young millennial, been there a month or two, and he sat down with her one day and gave her some constructive feedback. Next morning when he came in, her key was sitting on the desk and she was gone. Never saw her again. So they're not used to that abrupt feedback, and you have to be more careful. You still have to give constructive criticism. You just have to be careful about how you do it. They're from this entitlement generation. She says, I'm not giving you a trophy for emptying the dishwasher. And he says, well, that doesn't follow the pattern. And you look at all the trophies he's got for good attitude. Everybody's a winner. My kids were the weakest player on the worst team in our soccer league. And yet they got the same trophy that everybody else got. And why not? They didn't keep score, right? So, but in the business world, people do keep score. There are winners and losers. It's interesting, though, I found out about this generation, even though they didn't keep score, the parents didn't keep score. The kids knew who won and lost. The kids are very competitive. Millennials are very competitive. I'm starting to figure out, I think a lot of it comes from the video game culture. They compete against each other in these video games, and they want to win. So even though they've tried to take out this winning, it didn't work. Technology has really their language. It's amazing. Now, most of these kids that didn't grow up when there wasn't an internet. They can't imagine a time without email. Here in this one, the father's trying to send a picture, and the baby says, well, you need to put it on an email and attach it and send. So my kids have to help me with get the TV going and all the things connected to it. Matter of fact, my son, he's a freshman this year in college in engineering, but 2 summers ago, he came to work for our firm. I'm sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, my wife and I've been worried about him because he's a gamer and we can't, he's an introvert, we can't get him out. He just loves those games. I'm thinking, what happens when he gets a job? So I was real worried. Well, what are my people? Are they not going to tell me if he's not working out? So after the first week, they came to me and they said, you're not going to believe it. He's already figured out how to do Revit. He's doing 3D BIM modeling on computers. After a week, we've never had a graduate be able to pick it up that fast. So I was like, yes, there's hope. Some of these skills transfer, but boy, they with BIM coming in and some of the technology coming in, these kids eat it up. They're really good at that stuff. This one, she says, what's that long thing connected to my baby? And the doctor says she's never seen a cord before in her life, so she's having to get up to speed there. You like that one? All right, good. Consume information differently. This drives me nuts. Ask the son, you have any plans? And it'd be hard for me to know. With instantaneous communication, my generation can have ultimate flexibility. And over here, what are you doing? Nothing. What are you doing? Nothing. Just texting back and forth, but never doing nothing. My son was having some trouble figuring out what he was going to do with his girlfriend on a Friday night. They've been texting back and forth. I said, why don't you call her? He looked at me like I had 3 heads. Like, what do you mean? That's what a phone does, isn't it? They think differently. They have a desire to be carbon neutral, to give back. They want to know what their impact on the world is, and they'd like to make it a better place. And we'll talk about how this can play into what you do in your firms. No patience, yet not in a hurry. Boy, if this doesn't drive you nuts. No patience. I mean, they come out of school. I've seen some of them, a year out of school. Well, I want to be a project manager. Well, project manager is a pretty senior position. You got to work your way up and say, why do I got to work? I'm smart. I want it now. They want the career advancement now. And you tell them you have to build your technical skills. It takes time. Sometimes that doesn't want to communicate. But on the other hand, when it comes to starting a career out of college, they're in no hurry. This is interesting. When we graduated from college, what's the first thing you wanted to do? Get a job. What would your parents have said? Say, I'm going to take a year off and go do something. What do they say? No, because you won't ever come back. Or what if you said, I want to take a year off from school in the middle and go work for a year? No, you'll never come back. These kids do it. Especially a lot of them will graduate from undergrad, will go teach for America in the inner city for 2 years or do the Peace Corps or something. But yet they come back and they'll do their grad degree. So it's a different way of thinking. And I have used this to my advantage. We have a tremendous co-op program, and I talk about it in the book. I don't have enough time to talk about it here. But so we're hiring millennials to come in as co-ops. So we know which ones are really stars. They're interns. And what we've done is the ones that are stars that we want to hire full-time, we'll come to them if they're going to graduate in May. We'll come to them in January and say, listen, we'll give you an offer now. You can start when you graduate, or you can wait till September 1st when the summer's over and start. Why does it matter to me? I mean, I'd like to have them sooner, but they love it. They love it. I had 2 that were good friends. They took us up on that offer, and they got these 2 scooters, and they drove all over America, looked like Beavis and Butthead. But they had their great adventure, and then September 1st, boom, there they were, and they've been tearing it up ever since. So if you can give some flexibility in the start date, there's a lot of employers that won't do that. Cost you nothing, but it's a way that you can attract some of these young folks. Culture. So how do you develop a strategic culture based on the characteristics of this generation that's going to win with them? First thing I'd ask you is, do you have a culture in your office by design, or do you have a culture by default? I have heard people that call themselves leaders in our business. I'd say, well, I'd sit down and work with them and work with their organization or their team. I said, well, you need to do this, this, and this, and move in that direction. Sometimes they'll say, well, I do that, but my culture won't allow it. What are they telling me? They see themselves as a victim of their culture. Leadership is about shaping and directing the culture of your organization to be what you want it to be. It's not easy, but that's what you're trying to do. You need to own your culture, not be a victim of it. So what kind of culture do you want? If you have high turnover, you want to reduce it in that millennial generation, all you need to know is don't be a cake eater. Everybody clear? All right, we can go now. Are we good? Everybody knows what that means, right? Because I didn't know what it meant. I had a bunch of millennials around a table, about 10 of them, and we were at lunch, and I said, so I want to ask you guys something. You all came to work here full time, but most of you had other offers, and some of those offers were for more money. Why did you choose to come work here versus going to work for our competitors? And Kyle, again, he's their spokesman, he looks up and he said, that's because you guys aren't cake eaters. And all the millennials nodded their heads, and I'm thinking, what in the world is a cake eater? So we'll get to that in a minute. Don't you hate that? I'm killing you.
I see your picture, you keep flashing up too.
Is it? Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. Keep you awake. How you do it, we'll talk about not being a cake eater in a minute, but how you do it, what the answer is, create a performance-driven culture, reward performance, not sacrifice. I came up with this 7 or 8 years ago, and I've been preaching it across North America ever since, and I tell you, I have not found anything else that works better and will solve your problems with millennials. The best millennials want to be rewarded for what they do and the work they get done and how they move the business forward, not for their sacrifice. Now, what's the easiest way in our firms to measure sacrifice? Overtime, hours, yeah. See, and our the session before last was talking about bonus plans, and as we go through our whole bonus plan, you've got everybody's rating, but right next to it is that overtime number. And if something doesn't line up right, somebody said, wait a minute, this only got this much overtime. Should they get that bonus? Overtime and productivity don't align. Now, there are people that are very productive and work a lot of overtime. There's people that are very unproductive and work a lot of overtime. But you got to figure out what they're producing and not just reward. If you just reward overtime, your millennials that are producing they know who's doing the work and who's not. It'll drive them nuts. So to be able to do that, how to? Step one, you got to have performance metrics. You got to have some way to measure how your folks are doing. I found really the best way is you got to get it right down to the supervisor level because nobody knows what the person's doing better than the supervisor. So there has to be accountability down to that level. You need to regularly reward performance somehow. Millennials, as I mentioned, they're not patient. 1 year is a long time to them. It's not a long time to us anymore. But usually doing something quarterly seems to work better, and it doesn't have to be a cash bonus every quarter, but for your stars, finding a way to give them a gift certificate or even just a note to tell them you guys are really knocking it out of the park. Some way to reinforce on about every 3-month basis really aligns their actions, their current actions, with the rewards. And most importantly, you got to stop rewarding poor performance. And I'll talk about that as well. But let's go first to performance distractions, time clocks. Tell you it drives me nuts. There's still a lot of boomers and Gen Xers that say you got to be in your seat at 7:30. You can't leave till 5. You can only have lunch from X to X. I'm thinking, well, who really cares? Now, if you got a bunch of duds, you got to do that. But if you got star performers, I don't care. I've gone now we have core hours in my office, so it's between 9 and 4. I got some millennials that'll come in at 6 o'clock in the morning and leave 4, 5, 6. Some will come in barely awake at 9 o'clock, but they're still there at 9 o'clock at night working. In fact, what I've found is if you give people flexibility when to come in, they will come in when they're most productive. If you force them to come in, you're not going to get them when they're most productive. You're going to get them on your schedule. So having some flexibility there works. Dress code. Millennials favor a more informal dress code. We're certainly away from the suits and ties, but you do have to define the limits, or they'll have cutoff jeans and flip-flops. And I just had an argument last week with our CFO, and we were talking about millennials in our company, and he said, we had a guy that interned with us. He was the son of one of the older designers in the firm. He'd come in and interned the semester before last, and he was pretty sharp. And he had come back that summer to visit his father after he got out of school. And while he was visiting his father, he came over to the CFO's office and said, "Hey, mind if I come in? I was here and wanted to know if there's a chance if I come work with you full time when I graduate here at the end of the semester." And he told me, he said the guy had on jeans and a T-shirt, and he just thought because of that we should never hire him. I thought, wow, really? So I said, because it was disrespectful. First he came in, he came, knocked on my door, he didn't make an appointment or anything, and then so I asked him this. I said, well, so what did he end up doing? Well, he's working for our main competitor down the road. And he's still convinced he did the right thing. I'm thinking, it's different than the way we grew up. Another thing about millennials, they'll come across as disrespectful, and they're not trying to be disrespectful. The difference is the relationship they have with their parents, a lot of us, was more like a friend-to-friend relationship than the relationship we have with our parents. You think about these kids, we're close. My kids talk to us about things, and I'm like, I've never talked to my parents about that. But because of that, they are a lot more comfortable around adults than we are. They see them more as friends than as authority figures. Now, unfortunately, it comes across as being disrespectful, and sometimes you got to tell them, hey, so you don't do this with a client, let's talk about how to be respectful. But don't assume because they come across as disrespectful that that's what they're being, or you're going to miss out on an opportunity. And I think that's exactly what happened with my colleague. Personal calls, this is not as big as it used to be because everybody has a cell phone nowadays, but I've seen people say, look, you can't have personal calls during the day. If it's about performance, if it's about what you get done, you don't care about that stuff. Performance distractions. You see these guys a lot, they'll walk around the office, they got the earphones in their ears, and that drives boomers nuts. Get things out of your ears. You're supposed to sit around here and learn. Like this guy, well, what do you mean you can't study without your iPod? He said, I just can't. If music isn't constantly pumped through my brain, it affects my concentration. I get distracted without my distractions. There's some truth to that. Because of the world they grew up in as kids, they would be on the computer, playing a video game and texting at the same time. Their brains have developed differently than ours, and they really can do 2 or 3 things at the same time pretty good that we would never think of tackling. So, open communication. And I learned this at 6 or 7 years ago here at this conference. Some of the CEOs started saying, listen, our people want more financial transparency. You heard that with the Parsons fellow earlier when he was talking about the metrics that they share with their employee owners. I can tell you that this generation much more wants to know what's going on than previous generations. You think about your first year in the workforce. Did you go ask anybody, well, how's the company doing financially? No, you just put your head down and you did your job and hope to get a paycheck. Things have changed. They want to know how the organization is doing. And I tell you, if you don't let them know, they'll come to their own conclusions. You won't like the conclusions they come to. Now, I started 6 or 7 years ago with my millennials, sharing with them, hey, I'm going to let you know if things are going well or if they start to turn south, so that there won't be any surprises. And that worked for a while, but now as we're getting younger millennials in, that's not enough. So now what we do, we sit down once a quarter and we have a one-sheet summary we hand out per group on how their teams are doing, and it has a red light, green light, yellow light for backlog, for profit, for revenue growth, And that seems to work real well because now they feel part of the team. This is important to this generation. You have to communicate more than generations did with us. This sense of purpose is important. If you think about Gen X is motivated by money. If you think about who were the Gen X parents, what they call them. Remember the me generation back in the 80s? He who dies with the most toys wins. Matter of fact, we got the Back to the Future series a couple of Christmases ago, and we watched them with the kids one after the other because they had never seen them, which that was fun. But when I was watching the first movie, there's a scene there at the end. You know, he goes back in time, and his family's all a mess. And when he comes back, his family's great. Remember that? What was his family like when they were great? They were happy? What else? What? Wealthy. How did you know they were wealthy?
Their furniture was better. They had fancy cars.
Fancy car. He had a Mercedes. He had him a new truck. Remember, the brother had been working at McDonald's, but when he came back, he had a three-piece suit on. He was a businessman.
The class bully was polishing his car.
Class bullies polishing the car. Yeah, the girl now had a rich boyfriend. They were coming from the tennis club. He had written a book. He was very successful. When you watch that in the 80s, it felt natural. I challenge you to go back and watch it now, and something about it just feels weird because our culture has changed. That culture back in the 80s was very, he who has the most toys wins. It was very materialistic, and I was I was a part of it, so I didn't pick up on it then. But now when you watch it, something's odd. Now this generation is much more like the boomers. They're into how can I make the world a better place, like the boomers were when they were young, especially. Every one of your businesses, in some way, makes the world a better place. But when we're offering a job to millennials, what do we try to sell them on? Salary, benefits. Do we stop and talk about how we make the world a better place? Let me tell you, that can be a huge differentiator. And I have found it is challenging to do, to package and put out there. But the better you can do that, the more very talented millennials will want to come work for you. Dealing with the dead weight. Millennials are like any other generation. There are stars, superstars, and duds. If you keep around the duds, your stars and your superstars are going to leave. And when I say keep around the duds, you keep around the duds from any generation. They hate Gen X and Boomer duds. And we got them out there. But they see those guys, and they're working their tail off, and they see these guys above them, and they're like, well, what? Why is that going on? They won't tolerate that. So you have to work on that. I wish we had more time to talk about that subject. So, don't be a cake eater. It's a reference from the movie The Mighty Ducks, which is a millennial movie, and it referred to the bad guys who was the other hockey team that was stuffy, too stuffy. My competitor in the area, and I don't see any representatives in the room, so I'll tell you about them. They'll go over there and interview them, and these guys will have on a suit and tie. They'll interview with one person. They'll ask them 10 canned questions. Then they'll leave, and the next person will come in and ask them 10 more canned questions, and they'll go through 4 or 5 of these. It's very stuffy. When they come see us, we'll come in and we'll talk a little bit. We'll find out about them, and then we'll interview them. We'll ask them some questions, and when we figure out we got a keeper, we start taking them around the office, and they walk through our break room, and they look on the walls, and they say, "There are all these movie posters on the walls." Oh, well, every summer we go to a movie premiere. We let the young people pick which movie we're going to go see. Well, what's this plaque over here? Well, we have a chili cook-off every fall that people come in and cook chili, and we vote on who's the best. And what they're doing, they're starting to pick up. These people take their work seriously, but they don't take themselves seriously. They have fun. Most millennials are looking for that type of environment. They're not looking for that stuffy environment. So don't be a cake eater. So some myth busters. Myth 1, kids today are hopeless. This is that hell in a handbasket theory. Actually, this generation has the lowest rates of violent crime, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, teenage pregnancy of any generation yet. So the numbers support that they're a pretty good generation. Millennials are Gen X squared, and this comes mostly from boomers that said, boy, we had to deal with those dang Gen Xers. Now we got these millennials, they're twice as bad. really millennials and Gen Xers are nothing alike. Gen Xers, as I mentioned, they're more often motivated by money. They also like to work by themselves, being that latchkey generation, where millennials are much more of a team-oriented generation. So you have to manage them differently. A lot of people say millennials are not at all like boomers. Actually, that's not true. They're very similar to boomers in a lot of ways. If you think about the protests back in the 60s when the boomers were coming through, and now you see a lot of millennials were protesting Wall Street a while back. Then you had the boomers saying, well, wait a minute, that's my 401k we're talking about now. Let's back off a little bit. But the interesting thing is there's a lot of protest energy in this millennial generation that was also in the boomer generation. But the problem they're finding is the boomers had a lot of good stuff to protest. I mean, the government was flat out lying to people back then. The Vietnam War was going on. There were a lot of things to protest. The millennials are finding it hard to find good causes to protest, and as a result, they're starting to protest these minor offenses. And there's some interesting research that's out on that now. Some of their strengths and weaknesses: they have a very positive, can-do attitude. It comes from being told they can do anything, which is great. Weaknesses: they can be overconfident and they don't know their own limitations sometimes, so we have to make sure that they're not getting in over their head and causing quality issues or other problems. They are very goal-oriented, as we mentioned, but they've never had to set their own goals. You need to help. The good news is if you'll take time to sit down and set good goals for them, they'll knock them out of the park. So spend some time doing it. However, as you're doing that over time, you also want to teach them to set their own goals, because not only are they going to have to do that eventually, they're going to have to teach others to do it as well. They're very good at multitasking, but they struggle when they have to focus on a singular issue for a long period of time. And in our business, sometimes we have big projects that last a long period of time, and they can get bogged down in that. So you got to watch them and work with them in that area. They're very team-oriented. We mentioned that. This is because when they were coming through school, elementary school, as part of being prepared for this global environment, teachers were told they're going to have to work on teams when they graduate. So all through school, even back to elementary school, they had a lot of team-oriented projects where we didn't have very many. But you know what? This is a very team-oriented business, and getting much more so, and they're actually well-suited to survive in that type of environment. But they do have a difficulty dealing with difficult people. So you got to help them, especially with clients and colleagues, to be able to deal with difficult people and learn. So what's next? They're now talking about Generation Z. I'm sure it'll come up with its own names. These are kids 14 years and younger. What can I tell you about them? They will be different from millennials. Already seeing it. My wife studies social psychology in the grocery store checkout line, because you got all the parenting magazines sitting there. And she watches, and she said about the time this generation was born, the magazines started switching what they were saying of kids got to do everything. The kids need some white space. Kids need some downtime. So you're starting to see that shift coming. I can also guarantee you they will frustrate millennials. This is what I call payback, baby. And we'll be around to watch it, some of us. Yeah, they will frustrate millennials. Points to ponder. Are you training your Gen Xers and your boomers to manage millennials? Because you need your leaders in your firm to understand the generation, know how to work with them so that you can be successful. Are you prepared to serve millennial clients? The oldest millennials are 35. 35 is about the time that the stars in our client organization start to rise to important positions where we're interacting with them quite a bit. They will bring their millennial characteristics into the way they do business as well, so there'll be a change there. Are you giving your millennials leadership training? This is interesting. Recent studies found that a quarter of millennials are asking for a chance to show their leadership in the organization, but 3 out of 4 millennials believe their organizations could do more to help train them as leaders. So these 35, these kids between 25 and 35, it's time to start giving them some leadership training in our organizations and preparing them for the future. So I mentioned I wrote a book. This came out in 2009. It's and I wrote it because I was teaching these principals boot camps, and people wanted to talk about millennials, and it's a 2-day topic, and we just didn't have enough time. So I just tried to put a manual together with all the things you need to help your partners understand them and be strategic about them. If you're interested, they sell them for PSMJ sells them for $80, but they're selling them here for $50, and they'll mail them to you. It's only for architects and engineers, so it's a very small niche. But if you'll give me a business card afterwards, they'll mail one to you and send you an invoice. But it talks about keys to attracting the best. How do you unleash the power in that generation? I have some case studies from about 100 firms. Alex's is one of them that's in there, some of the things they were doing. Some of these firms are case studies of firms doing well. Some of them are firms that are doing poorly. And my favorite part is I got a 100% guaranteed hiring program. I've hired 20 millennials through this program over the last 15 years. Every single one of them has worked out to be a success. So all that's in there as well. Now, would you like to know what Kyle's doing? Kyle's doing a millennial sport called disc golf, and I was actually out playing with him. It's where you throw disc towards a basket. He had thrown his disc in the drink, so I took a picture on my cell phone of it. We actually blew it up in a big poster and put it back in the office. So, well, thank you very much for your time. I'll hang around afterwards. If you'd like to get a book, give me a card. Thank you.